2010 installation of the Regional History Forum. We've been going a number of years. I think we started these programs back in the late 70s, just shortly after the original courthouse was restored and moved to its location across over next to the Chamber of Commerce. We've been doing it every year since. Most of the years right here in this room. A couple of years, I think the year we were flooded off, we were over in the second courthouse, now the Clock Tower Pub. So it's good to have you here. This year, things really came together early on, and we thought, well, we had the programs pinned down in the middle of the fall, and got the publicity out very early, got posters all around town, and then the need to change things started to happen. So all of you who came today expecting Marilyn Erickson, well, you just have to come back next week. We tried to get the word out, but she had hip surgery and really needed another week of recuperation. So Jerry graciously consented to do the program today. Of course, we'll probably get a bunch of railroaders coming next week.
You got a bunch of them here already, huh?
The word does get around, so we trust that to happen. Let me just say on the last program, the last Saturday of the month, Barbara Telfer will be doing the program on the library and the old Carnegie Library building, now in its centennial year. And that is the only program that doesn't have any change to it.
So far.
So
Yeah,
far.
I'm trying to work out some change for you.
We can still work on that one. But, the 20th, let me make the announcement now, and we'll get that out in the paper and on the radio. Dee Gaston will be doing that program. She's a descendant of Gifford Pinchot and a very interesting family and an interesting book that she's put out on members of her family. And she will do that program at 11 o'clock in the morning that day, and the reason being Philip Clint's memorial service is that afternoon, 1 o'clock. So we thought rather than try to conflict with that, or some people having to be here and chase out or leave there and come over here, we would just ask her to do it early, and she's able to do that. So please spread the word around about that. Her program will be 11 o'clock in the morning that day. Well, I could almost say that our speaker today needs no introductions, because we've been introducing him how many years in a row now, Jerry?
About 4.
About the 4th year, which I think makes this the longest running single series in our Regional History Forum programs. Jerry, I don't know, if were you interested in railroads before you moved out there?
I'll tell you the story.
We'll get that story. But he keeps expanding the circles, so I don't know. Next year it may be about all the railroads in Oregon and Washington. But we're moving off from the Wasco County area to some of the nearby railroads, and I would like you to give a warm welcome to Jerry Tanquist.
I don't know if that's just taking me longer to get the story across, and I have to come back time after time, or what. Anyway, I'm glad to be here and to share these stories that I have. Before we get to that, an update on the program 2 years ago, the program on the Deschutes River Railroad Race. Well, last October, we restored that water tower at Harris Canyon, the only water tower left of the Deschutes out of 8. And I've got some pictures. Some of you like a copy of it. There are a bunch of them here. You can pick them up on your way out, of the restored tower. The new roof was put on, the bands were put back in place, and the staves that were missing were restored. And a company, a bunch of fellows from the SD Deacon in Portland, who were fishermen on the Deschutes and knew that tower well, and they were convinced to come up, and they did it. They gave their labor for free for a weekend and got it done. So those are the pictures there. That's just a little update on the former program. You have in your hands two documents. One is the map. And that's just a pretty rough drawing, but kind of give you a little bit of perspective of what we're talking about. And the railroads are numbered. And we'll start at number 1 and move around the map, 1 through 5. And they're listed over there. And the other printout sheet is also numbered that same way, 1 through 5, and it lists a little bit more detail on these 5 railroads that we're going to be talking about today. So that's just for your reference and to make it a little easier to follow. I realized as I was working through this, and Carl asked if I'd be ready to switch. I said I've been working on the thing all winter, but I covered this last week several things I wanted to modify, so I keep fine-tuning it and trying to make it a little more collected and pieces of it put together that belong together. So this is my first shot at it. We'll see what happens. We'll start with the Hood River line, and that line was built in 1905 and 1906 from Hood River to D. A lumberman had a mill, was building a mill at D, and he needed a way to get his timber out, and the railroad was built as far as D, and then about 1910 it was extended on to Parkdale. And when it was built, that railroad was part of Wasco County, because Hood River County came into existence in 1907. So anyway, that was originally it was in our county. This is a railroad bus that when they couldn't afford to run the whole train, they put flange wheels on a school bus and further common on these short lines to move passengers and to move the mail as needed. There's the depot in Hood River in 1908. Lots of folks dressed up, they're going on an excursion, and this is the way the depot looks there in Hood River today. The rail line, this line over here is the UP line that still carries those trains, and this is the Hood River Railroad line. And there's the station at Parkdale back in the days when it was functioning. There's the depot and some other buildings apparently alongside the railroad there. And this is the lumbering mill at D that I was just mentioning, and the railroad comes right up through here. Have I got that right? Yeah. And that mill burned several years ago, but you can see it was a big operation, and the railroad was really a necessity in order to get that timber out and get it to market. And as we look at some of these other railroads that we're looking at today, there were 4 of these 5 that we're looking at today had big lumber mills attached or part of the rail system. The railroad was necessary to get for them to operate, and this is certainly true there at D. This engine was only at Hood River for about 3 weeks in the summer of 2007. And I heard about it and got over there and got this picture and got a picture of riding it. Went up for as far as Odell and back. It was an engine from the Grand Canyon Railroad. This fellow that owned them, he had brought 2 of them from the Grand Canyon to Hood River on flat cars. The tenders hauled separately, and he had to put them all back together, and he had this one operating, but he soon realized that he wasn't going to be able to make it financially on Hood River line. So he took his 2 engines to Colorado, and they're on the railroad over there somewhere now. And that's being pulled by that engine. And this is one of their current day engines that take excursions and from Hood River to Pine Grove to Odell to D to Parkdale. And there's the Blue Goose there at the station. And this is they have a few extra rolling stock there in case they need to have a flat tire or something, I guess. This is the overpass on Highway 35, the railroad overpass. And there's a train coming across that same spot. They head down to the switchback. The switchback is just about half a mile below that overpass on the highway. And I walked down there one day. Betsy drove me over and waited for me. She's very patient with me doing all these things. This is only one of 6 in the country that still operate switchbacks to get where they want to go. And the reason for a switchback is that it comes up from down here in Hood River, and it's a steep grade, about 3.2% grade. And so they come up here and have a long track comes out here and dead ends, and they pull the train onto it. Then they throw this switch, and then they go uphill, backwards. So that's why that train runs part-time, it's running forward, part-time is backwards, because they hit this switch back and have to reverse the direction. But it does the job for them, and that's what counts. There's another view of the switchback. That's looking under the dead-end track where the train has to pull all the way under that before they can switch it over to the other line.
And you said there's only about 6 of those?
About 6 of those still operating in our country. It used to be
In
a
the
lot-
United
in
States?
the United States. It used to be a lot more common, and a lot of the railroads that had them were spur lines and small short lines, and they've closed. In South America, it's still fairly common because they do lots of mountaineering railroads down there. And as I was coming back up from the switchback, I got this train, so a little bonus shot there. Yeah. And that's the rest of the train has got its passenger cars on, and this is yet another train headed down, or coming up from the switchback. This is also in that same area. Well, that's Hood River. And then we switch over to the main line, and it's on the north shore of the Columbia, Burlington, northern Santa Fe. And it runs all the way from Portland to Spokane and all the way back to Chicago. But we're going to be talking about the section between Bingen, and Wishram. So that's the part that's near where we are here. James Hill was the builder of that railroad. He was a railroad tycoon back in the first couple of decades of the last century, and he built the Great Northern across the country from St. Paul to Tacoma, and then he, that was 1882 and 3, including the tunnels at Stevens Pass, and then he got control in 1893 of the Northern Pacific, which also came across that same part of the country, but he didn't have any access to Portland. And the railroad tycoon in Portland and in Oregon and California was James Harriman, Edward Harriman. And he was a pretty powerful guy too. These guys butted heads, and their most famous contact was, of course, building those railroads down up the Deschutes. But at this point, he was building the SPNS, which ran from Spokane through Wishram to Portland. That was in 1908, and it was SPNS until 1970. And then Burlington Northern took it over, took that name. Then in 1994, the Santa Fe was added to it. So it's the same, pretty much the same management, just enlarging their conglomerate organization. This was the initial run in 1908 at White Salmon. That's what the name of the town was there at the river at that point. And that was the first train you see the horses, buggies, and the buggies with horses. It was kind of a mixture there in those days. And there's the depot at Fort Dallas. Dallasport. And they had a station, and the train stopped there back in those early days. And this is now Wishram, and that was Fall Bridge, and that was the depot there. And of course, the trains still go through there, and Amtrak still operates on that line, and that's one of its stops is in Wishram. This is looking down from above a little bit, and there's the depot, and you see a bunch of the sidings there, and the Columbia River out here back. And there's a shot at Lyle crossing that bridge, crossing Klickitat, headed west. And this is the engine that ran on that line for many years. It was built in 1923 and carried traffic probably till about 1950. And then for many years it resided in Tri-Cities. Wishram didn't have much clout, but finally got enough muscle to bring it back to Wishram, and that's where it is now, on display there. Another shot of Wishram, and this time we can see Salado Falls over here, and there's the bridge, the Wishram Salado Bridge, and the roundhouse and the tracks and so on, all of it there. their most famous train was the SB, or the 700. That engine was built in 1938, part of a new series, and when they brought those engines online, it really upgraded the service, and this SBS 700 is still operating. It's stored in the Roundhouse in Portland, and it's going to be getting a new home in about a year or so, along with the Daylight and another engine. But this was an excursion in 1956. And there's looking at it head on. You see a guy standing on the front of it here. You can kind of get the perspective of what the size of that engine is. And there's that same engine in 2005 on an excursion to Wish Ram. That was a double-headed excursion. The Daylight and the 700 both pulled the excursion train with about 11 passenger cars, and so much pride in their engines that the Daylight pulled the train to Wish Ram, then had to switch engine to put the 700 on the front to go back. And they each had to have their moment of glory. This is the Broughton Lumber Mill, another mill that depends on the railroad. Here's the railroad just west of where? Stevenson? White Salmon? Yeah, okay.
West of the bridge.
Yeah, and here's the flume that used to bring the logs down. And that mill is pretty well closed now too. All the mills that we're going to be looking at are that way, but in their heyday, they depended on the railroad to get their products out. And this is a train coming by the Alabama, probably in the early 60s. And I've got a couple of pictures here of it. There's another one, and yet another. And then in 1994, the Burlington Northern became the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe. And a new color scheme, new patterns on the engines. Although we still see some green and black ones from the old Burlington Northern days, they just have never quite got them all repainted. But this is more the color scheme today. There on that line. If any of you ever chased trains, you realize it can be kind of fun. This was a picture I took west of Lyle. There's a kind of rest area a few miles west of Lyle, and tunnels in both directions. You look down at the tracks and saw the train coming through, so I got a couple of shots of it and raced ahead to Lyle, and it is coming into Lyle. And then I got back in my pickup and drove to Dallas-Port and got it right again. It gets to be kind of contagious when you start doing those things and you figure out a route where you can get in and get those shots, because that's part of the fun of it. And there's the old pattern on the Burlington Northern. But this was a fairly recent train in Wish Ram. Lots of trains on that side of the river, as there are on our side of the river. And some of those trains every day haul garbage from Seattle to the landfill at Arlington. This is one of those trains. The Renties now, they're headed back for Seattle. And that's another story at Arlington, or at Roosevelt, I should say, Roosevelt. They've got huge things to lift these things off and put them on semi-trailers, and they've got their own private road up to the landfill, so they don't pay gasoline tax or any of those kind of taxes to get their garbage disposed of. And another little bit of trivia, at the landfill, they generate enough methane that all their power at the landfill is generated from the methane that is produced from the landfill. So I thought that's kind of an interesting little piece of information. And that's off of the calendar. You see how bright those engines are and how snappy they look. Well, then we come around and some of those trains come across the bridge here at Salino. This one's just pulling onto the bridge, and it's coming across, and then finally it comes on through the bridge. I was chasing a train, but I just stayed in one place to do those pictures. And that train is headed up the Deschutes towards Bend and on south. Well, that's the story on that railroad. Maybe some comments or questions? I want to interject here, yeah.
I just had a small trivia question. That engine that's now under the roof at Wish Ram, I had had the impression that was the one that used to be at Maryhill State Park years ago.
Oh, okay.
I wondered if anybody knew.
Yes, it was.
That's where it was.
Yeah, that was a Great Northern engine. Actually, it never worked on the SP&S line, but Catherine May, congressman in the 1960s for the southern central part of Washington, badgered the SP&S to provide a steam engine for display, and the only one available was that engine 2507, so the Great Northern gave it to the SP&S to donate.
Okay, I appreciate that correction. I was scratching
Well,
my brain and it kind of went blank on me.
There's a lot of people that mistakenly think it was a regular engine on the SP&S line, but
It was from the Great
history
Northern.
shows it never did run on the SP&S line.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I remember as a very young child, it must have been like 1955 or 56, my mom took myself, my sister, and my baby brother out of Bush Ram back to Minnesota. And I can remember having to get out, we had a little sleeper room, and I can remember we had to get out into the hallway for them to make the bed down so that we could crawl into it. And in the middle of the night, of course, my brother, or my sister had to go to the bathroom. So we had to get out in the hallway and put up the thing so we could get the thing. But it's one of my first memories.
A real vivid memory.
Yeah, really vivid.
Another question over there. Yeah.
Did you mention, was it Harriman, the gentleman that was with Hill that did the railroad?
Those were the two chief guys, yeah.
Well, the reason was his first name William?
It was Edward.
Edward. Well, the reason I'm asking this question, there was a William Harriman in Dufur for years and years and years, and his nickname was Cubby. And he was one of the foremen out there. He was really a craftsman in all things, but he was one of the foremen for the orchard.
Oh.
And we had gotten well acquainted, knowing who he was, and I wondered if that was
I don't know that relation or not, but he was the father of April Harriman, who was an ambassador back in the last century and very prominent.
It's kind of interesting to find out because there's quite a history about Cubby. I understand, going to drag it out now, and I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, I'll make a note here so I don't forget that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lucille. Yeah, Don.
Well, I just wanted to honor my grandpa by saying he gave one of his legs to James Hill. We were really accident we worked for that.
Okay, is that here in the Northwest somewhere?
Yeah, I'm not sure where. He worked, I know he worked in Minnesota and he ended up in Seattle. And so various times.
Yeah, somewhere along there.
So where he lost his leg, I don't know, but he worked on some more Pacific ones.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, one more.
Might add something about this picture here. This line that runs south from Wishram along the Deschutes River was Hill's dream of going all the way to California. He actually did get that rail line extended into Northern California in 1931, but failed to, of course he had died by then, but he had failed to reach the metropolitan areas of California, the San Francisco Bay Area and the LA area. But with the merger with the Santa Fe Railroad, that dream came true. Now the Burlington Northern Santa Fe has continuous rail service from Vancouver, British Columbia to San Diego.
All right. Interesting update. Thank you for that. Are we ready to go on? Well, let's take a look at the Golden Mail line. It actually was built before this one we just looked at. It was first built in 1903. They've been talking about it over there in that county for 2 or 3 decades. They needed a railroad to get their farm goods out of that high prairie over there and down to the river and down to the market. And finally in 1903, they put together a package and got it built. From Golden Nail through Centerville down to Swale Canyon, the Clickadet River, and out to Lyle. The first engine was this Hinckley, built in 1881, and it was in service from 1903 to about 1925, I think it is, and then it was scrapped. They had to haul the goods from the Golden Nail end down to the river. And then they bought a barge line, and they could transfer all their shipping stuff under the river and ship it to Portland by barge. That happened, went on for 5 years until SB&S came through, as we just talked about. And this little Columbia River in northern, as it was first named into Goldendale, merged, became part of the SB&S. And there's a mixed train with consists of some freight cars and some passenger cars on the far end that heading up for Goldendale. This is the Fisher Hill Trestle, about 2 miles north of Lyle on the Klickitat River. Quite a bridge, as you can see, and it carried all the rail traffic that was sent that way. This is the way that trestle looks today. It's been rebuilt, and it's abandoned now. That railroad line was closed in 1991 or 2, and this section of it has become part of the Rails to Trails State Park up to Klickitat. And the bridge isn't accessible yet for pedestrians because they don't have the planks on it and the handrails that are required, but that's part of their program to complete that trail program. And this is excursion train heading on up the river. A few folks riding on the back. I can remember riding on some trains where excursion trains and you stayed in your seat. You didn't get to move out on the platform or look out the window or do anything. You stayed seated. But here the folks can get out there in the back and probably enjoy the view and so on. This is the bottom of Swale Canyon. Just a two unit there. There's an engine and one freight car. This is the railroad track going up Swale Canyon. I think we're looking downhill here. That was the steepest part of the grade, 2.3%. And sometimes they had to put on an extra engine, but they had much of a train to make it up there. And they had this kind of problem from time to time. This was 1964 when the section of the track was washed out. The same flood that took out the tracks in Sherman County and probably some other places around as well. And Centerville kind of boomed in those days, and these grain elevators were built. Cement ones usually were built in the early 30s. And there's the elevators at Goldendale and the depot with an excursion train there in 1966. I think the passenger service, well, I'm not sure. I was going to say, I thought it closed out before 66 going into Goldendale. Any of you have any clues?
It ended sometime in the late 40s or early 50s.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, back earlier. Yeah. And there's one of the trestles there in Swale Canyon. There's 13, a total of 13 along that stretch going up that canyon. And most of them are still intact because the railroad hasn't been gone that long. And these are part of that new trails, Rails to Trails program. And there's another trestle there. And there's a group hiking up on top after they come out of the canyon headed for Goldendale, enjoying the walk and the scenery and everything along the way. Well, we can't go through Klickitat and town of Klickitat without talking about the mill there and the railroad there. It was an important supplier, just like these other lumber mills were. And this mill in Klickitat was built in 1915, or 14 and 15, and it meant bringing logs down from up on the high country up mostly west of the river, and they built railroads, probably more than 100 miles of railroad, where they built a line, and when they got through logging, they'd move the track over to another spot, and so they get the logs out. And it was a vital part of the success of the Klickitat Railroad, that the SB&S line into Goldendale, was the business they got from the lumber mill. That's what really kept them going as long as it did. When the mill closed in 1990 or 91, that kind of really spelled the end of the railroad because there wasn't enough other business to make it profitable. That's a little bit blurry, but they're dumping logs there into the pond. And there's another one where they're rolling them off. I've got a story about a man who was an engineer. His dad was an engineer, and he too was an engineer in this railroad, but I'm going to save that story till we get to Kinzu, because he also moved to Kinzu, so I'll put the whole story about this guy, Marengo, when we get to the Kinzu section. There's what's left of the mill, mostly just the the footings and the floors. You can see a smokestack still standing up there, and a couple of buildings up above it there a ways. And they saved one of the railroad crossing signs for their school crossing. That's the original sign there for the railroad. And the Vandals is the name of the model of the motive of the kids at school. So they saved a little bit of history there, that spot. Okay, but anybody have some comments about the Goldendale line? Yeah.
Okay, this railroad was constructed prior to the main line.
Yeah.
So how did they get the engine there? Did they haul it in on wagons or? I mean, that must have weighed a lot.
That's a good question.
Came in by boats,
They would have to come by boat,
yeah, from Portland.
So they had there's a mouth
A
on it or
huge
something.
barge.
And that's how they got their balance of the materials to
Yeah.
construct the
Uh,
lines.
It may have been a ferry boat, like Jim Hill used to crossing the Columbia, where they built the bridge there at Wishram. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
I noticed in those pictures that the first one looked like it was a Shay and then a geared locomotive and then a Heisler or a Climax geared locomotive. Were they all geared locomotives on that line?
On the Clickadet Lumber Company, they were all geared railroad.
Yeah, okay.
Motors, engines. And the reason is that those geared engines have so much more power, and they're designed to take sharper curves. And if you've ever ridden behind one, it's just going and you're only going about 10 miles an hour. I mean, it's just, the engine really races, but it puts in lots of power onto the driving wheels. I've got some pictures in this section of the program that we can look a little closer at those gears.
Can you tell us non-railroad people a little bit about what you just said?
Yeah, what kind of
Wait till I get the picture of the
Okay.
engine. It's easier to,
Yeah.
it's easier to show it than to try to describe it.
So you'll tell us whether these are steam or
Yeah.
oil or whatever,
Yeah.
okay.
There's Edward Harriman. He was the competitor with James Hill on the Deschutes, but he was also building, came into control of the Union Pacific through the Dalles, from Portland all the way to Chicago. And he was determined to build that railroad down the Deschutes too, just as Hill did. But in this case, our story today is about his building the railroad from Arlington to Condon. And he wasn't, his name isn't directly attached to that, but it was his company that built it. And it was a few years before they changed the local name of the railroad to become Union Pacific Condon Line. But this is the guy that is behind it all. And there's an old picture of the water tower and an engine there before you get to Condon. And there's the Condon Depot about 1930. And it's interesting, as I was doing these programs, both the Goldendale and this line, that had a lot more pictures of the logging railroads and their engines in both cases than I did of the main line. Somehow those pictures, I haven't found them, or they aren't as prominent or whatever, but this is one of the few I found of that line there coming into Condon. About 46 miles. It was a tough road to build because it was uphill almost all the way, sometimes 2% grade, and it was just a real challenge. And lots of farm produce to ship out of there. And it was built in what's the paper say, 1905, I believe. It served that area well. And there's that depot today. It's now part of a museum there, part of its railroad museum, part of its local history. And the depot there alongside of it there is also part of that history. The caboose, I should say. There's a part of the right-of-way as it looks in these days. It's the highway just beyond it there. This is the highway over here. And it runs across the prairie there for a lot of miles. And this is one coming into Windolin through a cut from the elevator that was there in the days of the railroad. This railroad was closed in about, basically went out of business in 1976 when they closed the Kinzu Mill. There was only occasional traffic into Condon after that because the logging business carried the freight literally, and the expense of running the railroad. So these tracks weren't pulled up till in the early 1990s through this part. And there's the one at Michael cut. And then we get on to Kinzu, and Kinzu has always had kind of a special interest for me because it's a remote place. It's a place that's come and gone. It's not there anymore, you might say. But there's lots of history. And in 1927, a man named Wetmore, he was a Pennsylvania businessman and had been buying timber in Wheeler County east of Fossil for many years. And he decided in 1927 it was time to harvest his timber. So they built the railroad. He financed it, and it was about 24 miles into Condon. It was actually a separate line. I always thought that Condon, Kinzu, and Southern was all one line from Arlington all the way. But this last part was a separate railroad, and they connected and transferred their traffic onto the UP line at Condon when they come out of Kinzu. There's the way the mill looked in its heyday. It was really a thriving place, and it was a company town. The company owned everything. The stores, the mills, the school, the whole place. And when they closed in 1977, they moved it all away. It was all gone. And I went to Hefner, most of the mill, and it operated there until the early 1990s. And there's another picture of the mill in the pond there. They have a reunion in Kinzu every summer. It's been over 30 years since the mill closed, but the old timers and their kids, now grown up, come back for this reunion from all over the country. And they have a big time just sharing stories and reminiscing and reconnecting. And we went out to it here a year ago, and it was a lot of fun. I met a lot of people who had worked there and knew about it, and they were excited and still excited because they still come back for that reunion. Now this is a Shea engine, and the driving power, you see this box here and one next to it, there's 3 of those. And those each hold steam, and they push these pistons down, and along here are kind of like a crankshaft. This is a crankshaft right here, and then there's geared to all the wheels. I think I've got a better picture that shows it. No, that's not the one. That's probably the same engine. The crew was come around, they had a photo op, so they all climbed on it. You see those big saws they used out there in the woods. Now that's the Heisler. And I've got a better shot of that one too. Let's see. You can see these 2 round things right here. Those are the steam pistons that drive the gears. And I've got still a better shot here. There's the Heisler running gear. This is the steam piston. Forces it in there and drives down like in a car. The crank, the piston works on the crankshaft. Here's the crankshaft down here. See how this is notched? And there's a universal joint there and one on the back side, and it drives power both front and back to all the wheels on the engine, and usually also on the tender. So there's lots of power put to it directly from this steam, which pushes that piston down, and one on the other side the same way, that works an alternating way. Is that helpful?
Yeah, is Heisler like a company name?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And Shea was built, that was a corporate name built a lot by Lima locomotive. And that's the same engine in retirement. And there's even a little better shot there of see the running gear here underneath. It's like a drive shaft on a car. The shaft goes all the way back to all those wheels. It's geared up to ones in front as well. And it makes it go. Now this one is, it's number 91, now called the 91. We were talking about it when you fellas about one that went to Mount Rainier Railroad. And this is one that came out of Kinzu. And recently it gone to Mount Rainier and is operating and used as a excursion train. This is the rail bus that they had for a few years there. The same reason they had it at Mount Hood Railroad. Couldn't afford to run the train, but they could haul passengers and the mail and so on. There's a camp scene from out of Kinzu back to the woods. It's 17 miles to Camp 5. I'm not sure what Camp 5 means, but it's because it's 17 miles out. They had railroad in there until about 1950, and then when they converted from steam to diesel, they took the tracks out and they hauled the lumber in by trucks, just like they did at Clickitat. It was 1964. They took the rails off their lumber lines, and they used logging trucks to bring the logs down to the mill. This is the story I want to tell about Lorengo, Louis Lorengo. He, as I mentioned here a minute ago, his dad went to Clickadet back 2 railroads back on our story, and went to work there in 1913, running those steam-driven locomotives up in the woods. This guy was born in 1912, so he was just a little kid when his dad got there. But by the time he was 16, this boy, Louis, he was a fireman on one of those engines. His dad was the engineer, and that's probably how he got the job as a fireman. His dad trained him on the job. And Louis, by the time he was 25, he was an engineer. So he was moving right up the ranks in the railroad business. And in 1949, he saw an ad that they were looking for help on the high slope railroads over Kinzu. And he thought that might be a good job because they couldn't log year round at Clickadet because that high country was snowed in. But over in Kinzu and Wheeler County, they could pretty much log all year long. And so he applied for the job in 1949, moved to the competing railroad. This is probably him, although I haven't been able anybody to help me identify that here in the engine. He ran that engine from 1951 when they converted from steam to diesel electric. Well, they closed the mill at Kinzu in 1976. That was the time he retired. He would have been 64 or something like that. But he retired, moved to Maupin, and in 1981, Fritz Kramer wrote a story about him in the senior highlights, and this is where I got some of the story about Louis Lorengo, the railroader. And at that time, in 1981, he was living in the Dalles. I wonder if any of you had ever met him or knew him or know any of his family, or have been trying to track down the genealogy. Society doesn't have anything. Went out to the cemetery, didn't have any records of burials out there. Anyway, I'd like to complete that story. If any of you have anything about Louis Lorengo, I'd sure be glad to have you talk to me about it. When he retired, they switched to this electric engine in 1951, and there was a Fritz Kramer writing about it, said that one of the obvious reasons they switched from steam to diesel was that to move a trainload of lumber out of Kinzu to Condon, which is 24 miles, it took 1,500 gallons of fuel on the steam engine. They could move that same load of timber, 150 gallons of fuel with the diesel. So that's 10 times saving in terms of fuel. So that's another little bit of trivia there. Well, there's the Wheeler Courthouse. I had to throw that in because the Kinzu line was the only railroad that ever went into Wheeler County. And Wheeler County does touch Wasco County down out of Antelope, so it kind of sits in our program today. And the last bit of that line that remains is the line that comes up from Arlington to the landfill out of Arlington, about 10 miles. This is the UP train bringing in a load of trash from Portland to the landfill there. Okay, any stories or comments or questions about the Kinzu line? Yeah.
That mail passenger car on the Kinzu line, they call that the Goose.
Oh,
Everybody calls it the Goose.
okay. That the bus that had the flanged wheels?
Right.
Yeah, okay. And those were pretty popular. There was one on, well, I guess it was the one that was on Kinzu that went over to Lowell Minor for many years. It was over there on a display somewhere. Yeah.
I was just wondering, Kinzu, do you know where the name came from, or do you have any idea?
I'd have to research that. I don't recall offhand.
I'll check in Oregon Geographic.
Yeah, there you go. Another bit of trivia about Kinzu is that when the company closed and moved the town away, but they left the golf course. And it's the only 6-hole golf course in Oregon, at Kinzu. So if you really want an experience, ask Betsy. I took her golfing over there one day, and you had to really keep score. What hole do you go to next? You go around 3 times. It's kind of unique.
Jerry?
Yeah.
Why didn't the railroads get the contract to haul the garbage from Portland to Arlington? you know, they truck it, which I felt was really a very inappropriate decision,
Yeah,
using up our highway
yeah.
space. Do you know anything about that?
Well, what I read is that it's a 20-year contract that gets renewed periodically, and there's apparently enough clout among the businesses that run the trucks that keep their bid in, and whether it's actually a lower bid than the rail, I don't know that part, but it seems to me the rail would be the more efficient way to do it.
I can add just a little of that. When the garbage first started being hauled from Portland to the Arlington landfill, there was an article back in the back pages of the Oregonian one time. Actually, it was in a column, and the columnist was grumbling about he wished that the contract had gone to rail service. However, the trucking contract had came in at 20 cents per ton cheaper.
Okay. So that's, was certainly part of the answer to that question, but it still doesn't quite satisfy some of us, I guess. Okay, anything else on the Kinzua and the Arlington
One
line?
question.
Yeah.
Was there any attempt at conservation of the resource? I mean, it just seemed like it just kind of, the woods were raped, so to speak, and the railroads took it out.
Yeah.
And, you know, was there any people that were concerned about that?
Probably were, and Gifford Pinto would have been one if he'd been alive, and probably some others, but the commercial interests seem to have the upper hand on even as that conflict goes on today about thinning or letting them stand and, you know, that sort of thing. It's just some politics involved, no doubt, and some economics. And when the Forest, a little aside on the Forest Service, they talk about managing it for sustained yield, but they haven't done that. You know, there's been so much pressure to get the timber out to meet the demands that they've pushed the limits, and so it's kind of a long-term thing happening. Anybody else? Are we ready to go on? Okay, we come into Sherman County, and some of you are probably pretty familiar with this. I see Joanne von Borstal here, and Cal McDermott, and probably some others of you who are associated over there in the Sherman County. That line went from Biggs to Morrow to Shannaco. It was built in 1897, the first leg of it from Biggs to Wasco. It was, they had a big dream on this one too. They were going to go from Wasco, or from the Columbia to Prineville. Prineville was the goal of Oregon, of the railroads that went up to the Deschutes. They didn't go to Prineville as it turned out, but Central Oregon. And they had this dream in Sherman County that they'll build through Sherman County and onto Prineville. And for that matter, John Heinrich in the Great Southern here in Wasco County, that was his dream, was to go to Central Oregon and onto California. So all those railroad builders in that era were thinking about moving past where they actually got. This line was, this is one of their first engines, and it was sold in 1915. There's the station at Biggs with the train there and at the stop. And another shot of the depot and the town over here in the background. It had some bad wrecks up that Spanish Hollow route, not only the 164, but before that, things would go askew and muck, and made for a lot of tough recovery work. This is a train in 1900 moving past Wasco from 1899 to 1900. That year they built up through Klondike and to Hay Canyon and to DeMoss and to Morrow. And I've got to tell you a story about, well, we'll get to Klondike here in a minute. Save that one. Here's Wasco in 1905. The depot, and that depot is still standing. That's the way it looks with, again, a caboose alongside there, and they've done a nice job of collecting railroad memorabilia there. And if you're interested in really seeing what they've got, and you get to Wasco and it's not open, go across the street to the city hall and talk to the clerk there, and I've been in there a couple times, and I've had to say I'm too much of a hurry, but she said, she'll call the lady that opens the place, she'll go out on call, open the place, the depot, and show people if you're interested, like, go across the street there and inquire. And there's the elevators now at Wasco. You notice that there's many of these scenes, there's two kinds of elevators. There's a wooden crib, which these ones covered with metal here, and then there's the cement ones. The wooden crib ones were the oldest, and in 1930, about that era, they started building the cement ones. It's true of a lot of railroad stuff. You notice that at Centerville and Goldendale as well. And there's Klondike, and Klondike got its name because they were busy building there about 1898, and the gold rush in Klondike came along, and all the guys abandoned the railroad and went gold hunting. And so they gave that name to that station. There's a little bit of current stuff happening. You see the windmills over there, all around Klondike nowadays, with the new stuff coming in. And then drop down to Hay Canyon. Again, there's the cribbed wooden elevators in the old days, and there's the Hay Canyon elevators today, and the windmills in behind them. And somewhere through Sherman County, I've never gotten any help exactly where this wreck was, but the trestle was weakened somehow, and the train got on it. It was a real disaster. And if you can help me with that, I'd be glad for some more information. And there's the DeMoss elevator right alongside the highway going towards Morrow. And there's the Sagebrush Annie coming down through that same stretch there somewhere back in 1902. So that was back in the early days. And there's the Morrow warehouse with hundreds of bags of wheat waiting to be loaded and hauled away. And there's the Morrow elevators today. And the courthouse there. And then we move on to Grass Valley, and it had a depot and a station. And trains served through there, and traffic pretty much ended there about 1944, if I have that right. Trains only ran as far as Morrow after World War II. But in the meantime, they had an engineer that apparently was twittering on his cell phone. Wasn't paying attention there. And there's the Grass Valley today with two sets of elevators. And then we move on to Kent. You see both the old and the new elevators there, the wooden ones here and the cement ones. Wheat, of course, was a big time in Sherman County and still is a big time in Sherman County. And I think they still use most of those elevators, don't they, Cal? And they haul stuff in and out by truck. You know. And there's Shannaco, and of course what they shipped out of Shannaco was wool. And their heyday was that first decade. When the railroad reached there in 1900, when Shannaco became a city. It used to be down there in Cross Hollows, a little hotel and a little way station. They moved up on the flat there and built the railroad in, and became quite a city. The railroad had as many as 16 employees living in Shannaco that worked on the railroad. So that was a really big time. And there's the water tower. It looks like one of there at Harris Canyon we worked on. The bands were loose, and this tower is long gone. And there's an engine there in Shannaco with a fellow, a crew member, and his son sitting there. His son was standing there beside him. And this guy's got the big oil can working that engine ready to get it going. And another shot there in Shannaco. And another one at the depot. And there's the depot with the train, and people were getting ready to board and head out. It was a big time. Shannaco, that's the way it looks today, the warehouse that's left there, and that's the backside of it. The railroad right-of-way is right here. It comes along here and along the side of the warehouse. But with this shot, I've got to tell one more story. If we've got time for another railroad story. It connects Shannaco with the Johnson place where we live. We live on 15 Mile Creek, just east of town here, 10 miles. And in 1918, Norris Brown. Some of you probably know Norris. You know Gary Brown over in Sherman County, and helped me with Fritz Clausen, not Fritz, John, and help me, Clausen in Doofer. Anyway, maybe I got this story crossways. But let me go back to Norris Brown. In 1918, his parents lived on a farm in Bacon. They ranched there and farmed there. And when Norris was about due to be born, and they'd already planned this ahead, they wanted to go to Grandma's house because Grandma knew how to take care of new babies and new mothers. But Grandma lived on the Johnson place where we live, down here in Wasco County. So, planning ahead, they hooked up the team and drove into Shannaco, left the team, got on the train from Shannaco to the Dalles, got off that train, got on the Great Southern, out 15 Mile Creek to our place, got off to Grandma's house. That's where Norris was born. And the doctor was just a mile up the road at that time, and Norris, when Norris told me this story here a few years ago, it kind of blew me away, because that gets kind of personal when the railroad story is attached right to the place where you live. And three of his sisters were also born at Grandma's house there, where we live. Same process. The railroad was pretty important in getting that mother to the right place for the birth of the babies. So that's my story about Sherman County Railroads, and yeah.
I just thought the Shannaco, at the bottom of the stairs down there, we have the podium that they use to haul around and sell the lots. They'd move it, they'd have the lots of wool around, and they'd move the podium around and say, okay, now we're bidding on such and such a lot. So
You've got that right down here.
right down here at the bottom of the stairs.
Okay, that's new to me.
Yeah.
I want to take a look at it.
Yeah.
Any other stories coming out of Sherman County that we want to mention? That brings my program to an end. Thank you.
Many of you here came for the railroad story. Show your hands. Very good show. Now, be honest, how many just really came for the cake and the cookies? I want to just comment on a couple things about the SP&S Railroad. When I started working for them in 1964, there was on an average 3 freight trains each way a day on that line. Occasionally there might be a 4th train one way or the other. Nowadays they run approximately anywhere from 12 to 18 trains each way a day on that line, so you can see how much rail business has increased. Now, talking about the elevators on these lines that are abandoned, the real culprit there was the Columbia River. As the barging became more and more easily accessible, more grain elevator operators found out it was cheaper to truck the grain down to the river and load it on a barge. But that didn't really hurt the railroads all that much, because look at all of the intermodal business they carry now, these truck trailers on rail cars. What I wanted to talk to you about, and another thing, talking about the switchback on the Mount Hood, the logging railroad out of Klickitat had a switchback there, right out of Klickitat, on the old line that used to run out of Klickitat west up into the hills towards Liberty Bond and places like that. If you're ever in the town of Klickitat, if you look up on the hill to the north, you can see part of the old switchback grade there. Now, I want to talk to you about the Klickitat Logging Railroad. First of all, how many people here knew that in the 1920s there were steam locomotives that were actually constructed in Portland, Oregon? They were called the Willamettes. They were actually a copy of the Shea locomotives that we saw pictures of here. The reason they could do that was the patents on the Shea gearing system had expired, so it was a free market for anyone, and the Willamettes Iron and Steel Company started building geared locomotives that are just quite similar to the Shea locomotives. They didn't build very many. They only built 33 of them. There are still 6 of them in the nation that are still can be seen on display, and there is one operating that's been restored to operating condition up at the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad at L.B. Washington that was mentioned. That engine was the last one constructed by the Willamette Iron and Steel, and it was built in 1929 for J. Neal's Logging Company at Klickitat. So that's pretty interesting. That engine was restored to service last year, is now hauling trains occasionally on the line at L.B. And they have a problem. The engine was built in 1929, went into service the first few days of the 1930 at Klickitat. It operated at Klickitat until 1949 when the Klickitat owners sold it to the Rainier Logging Company up on the Olympic Peninsula. It operated there until 1962 when the steam engines were retired on the Rainier Railroad. A Rainier company employee bought the locomotive, had it trucked on the highways in 1962 to Port Angeles, stored it in a building in his yard for years, and early in the 2000s it was trucked on over to LB, and it cost almost $400,000 to get it restored. A lot of that was grant money. They have painted the engine back into the Rainier color scheme that engine was in, but they've been looking to find a picture of when it worked out of Klickitat. At Klickitat, it was the number 6 engine. So far, no one has been able to produce a picture of that engine at Klickitat. It wasn't lettered for the Klickitat Log and Lumber. It was J. Neal's Lumber Company is how it was lettered. But they've been looking for this picture, for a picture, for a long time of it with the J. Neal's lettering and the number 6 on it. So you folks here in this area, as you talk with friends and all that, if you know someone that might have old logging railroad pictures from this area, if they dig through there and find a number 6 picture of this engine lettered number 6 for J. Neal's, if they could either send it to the Mount Rainier Railroad Company up in LB, Washington, or even send it to me, well, that's, we'll make sure to get, just a photocopy of the picture deal. Okay. Also, for those of you that would be interested, when I heard about this deal last night, I quickly ran off a bunch of pictures I found on the computer of some of the engines on the lines that Jerry's talked about. You folks, while we're milling around afterwards, want to take a look at this, just find me and take a look. And I'm in a really generous mood today, so I'll let you look at it for only $10 a page. I got to figure out some way to fund supper tonight.
Actually, I hope a lot of you look at it because he's gonna have to pay $100 to get downstairs.
I hope a lot of you
Sir, I am at a disadvantage. I don't know who you are.
do. Well, my name's Jim Fisher.
Hi, Jim Fisher. I'm Sandy Bissett.
Glad to meet
I
you.
sort of run this place.
Well, good. I hope I haven't violated anything.
Yeah, Sandy's our president, and she has a word for everybody, and remember next week, come back, and Marilyn Erickson will be here with her program on the courthouse.
Thank you very much for coming. We have, and those of you who have not been here since last year, realize that a lot of things have changed. And but in amongst a lot of things changing, a lot of things have stayed the same. We're still the same old organization, the same old people, and old people, young people, and Sandy, you're digging that hole pretty deep. Okay. Anyway, last September we had the Historic Canals Days play up here, and we got into a situation with the fire marshal. So thanks to that, we have new seating, we have new one motion door handles, we have new exit signs, and our fire extinguishers are in different places, and so you are all safer. Anyway, the original way that we had our seating was not going to work anymore as far as the fire regulations. And so how do you like it this way?
That's good.
We can actually seat more people this way.
Yeah.
So that's
Did you paint the walls?
Pardon?
Did you paint the walls?
Nope. But it's amazing when you open the drapes,
Yeah.
how different it looks. Anyway, you all should have gotten a little green sheet and a story behind this, and I decided that I'm going to, every week this month, I'm going to leave something on your seats. And next week, we're going to talk about the Oregon food. Anyway, I do genealogy research and was tracking down some leaves in upstate New York. And this article, as you see, is from the Watertown, New York Reformer in September of 1850.
And suddenly, here was this word Oregon. Well, you know, nobody from, when you're scanning, you know, if you're from Oregon, it kind of jumps out at you. And if you've read it already, you know that it refers to another article in the paper, which I was not able to track down. But anyway, Jerry's been talking about railroads, and the bigger issue is transportation in general. And if you look at where Watertown, New York is on the map, it's on Lake Ontario. From our perspective, it's pretty landlocked. But if you think in terms of railroads and toll roads and canals, it has an accessibility to the west that we wouldn't even think about. And I just thought it was, Oregon became a territory in 1848, 2 years after the settlement of the 49th parallel between the United States and Britain was finally, the treaty was finally signed. This was 2 years later, and someone, the newspaper, about as far away as you could get from Oregon and still be in the United States, has these interesting things to say. So I thought that was kind of fun. Anyway, turn them over. You guys sticker on the back? There should be 3, and I have a hunch what I'm scrolling over here. Anybody else? Well, then, if there are pieces next to you, look at those. Well, we're going to give some door prizes. So, Jan, pick out which one you would like to have.
Oh, that kind of really
I can't see. Just take whichever one. Okay, so now I have to think on my feet and come up with something. Who came the furthest? You did. Anybody further than Goldendale? Pardon? Wow. Both of you?
No,
Where'd
you come from?
Yes, you did.
He came from Portland. Or from Vancouver.
Okay.
but Vancouver.
Vancouver, where are you?
Right here.
Very good. Thank you for coming so far to join us, and like Carl has told you, we've tried to keep you on your toes by switching things around, and we hope to see you regular time next week at 11 in the morning on the third week, and back here at regular time on the fourth. And coffee and cookies downstairs. Have fun.
So Lori's gonna put the baby back.